Hey guys, and welcome back for another episode of my mystery series, where today I want to share with you the case of Dana Bradley. Despite a very intense and highly publicised investigation in the aftermath of Dana's death, even a confession and then in 2016 a reinvestigation, the case remains open and unsolved. It's been 40 and a half years since Dana was murdered, and nobody is willing to give up on the investigation anytime soon. Her family are really hoping that new forensic DNA technology might finally be able to provide them with some answers. Dana Nicole Bradley was born on the 24th of July 1967, making her 14 years old on the 14th of December 1981 when she disappeared from her hometown St John's in Newfoundland, Canada, the largest city in the province, but still very much had a small town kind of vibe, an everyone knows everyone kind of place. Dana lived with her mum Dawn and her stepfather Jeff, who had come into Dana's life when she was still very young. I couldn't really find any information online about her biological father, and for all intents and purposes, Jeff was her father, it seems. Dana was in grade 9 at the time of her death, and it said that she had this great personality and an artistic flair. Her high school principal, Fred Talk, said to the Telegram, "That kid could have been anything, whatever you wish. Dana was a good kid. She would have been a fantastic adult." Dawn and Jeff, her parents, have remained quite quiet over the years. Dawn especially very rarely agrees to speak to the media about Dana's disappearance, saying that it's just too difficult for her. But they have said that they know that investigators are continuing to do everything they can, and they appreciate the public support in this case. In fact, the most I could find that they've said publicly is in regards to a very controversial Facebook page about this case called Justice for Dana Bradley, which is run by somebody with no connection to Dana or the family. But instead, Dawn and Jeff say that they're trying to push a false narrative of this case. They've spoken publicly about how social media is somewhat of a double-edged sword for them, that the spreading of Dana's case and public awareness is always going to be very helpful, but that it can come with a lot of misinformation which can damage the case. In light of that, with this video, I'm going to be extra careful with the details I share. I mean, I don't often speculate in my videos anyway, as I don't really ever think speculation is helpful, but I am just going to steer clear of that completely in this one, instead just sharing all the facts of Dana's story and the investigation. Just what you hear in this video is cold, hard facts. I really do think there's a big chance of this one getting solved. I think they're getting closer every day, and the official investigators aren't going to give up until they see this one solved. So I really don't think the public should give up either. As a spokesperson for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police said to the Telegram in 2017, tips do continue to be received on a regular basis and they're thoroughly investigated. There's an entire 5-person RCMP major crime unit involved in this case, and despite what the media sometimes like to report, this is not a cold case. This is very much still active. But as I was saying before I went off on a bit of a tangent there, this was the 14th of December 1981 when Dana Bradley went missing. It was a Monday, so she'd been at school for the day before going to a friend's house after school for an hour or so. Dana knew she couldn't be there for long though, because it was her mum Dawn's birthday and she had to get back home for the birthday celebrations. Just before she left her friend's house to head home, Dana called her family and said that she was going to walk to the bus stop. She'd be home around 5:30. Wearing blue trousers and cowboy boots, she left her friend's house and walked towards the bus stop on Topsail Road, which is just across from the Tim Hortons or McDonald's that was there. Different sources say different things, but according to Google Maps, they're basically next door to each other anyway, so along that area of the road. What happened next, we know only thanks to 2 witnesses, Harry and John Smeaton, brothers who were selling Christmas trees on the empty lot behind the bus stop. After a very long day, they were just sat in their truck people watching, and they watched as Dana walked towards the bus stop. But then she did something strange and she stuck out her thumb to hitchhike. Now nowadays hitchhiking isn't something most full-grown adults would do, let alone a young teenage girl, but it was fairly normal behaviour in St John's at this time. The only thing that struck these men at the time as strange was that she walked to the bus stop to hitchhike, and we know that she told her family she was intending to catch the bus home. Perhaps she was intending to catch the bus, but on her walk there, maybe she got concerned that the bus would be late and then she'd be late for her mum's birthday celebrations, or perhaps she was just impatient and wanted to get home quicker, so decided to hitch a lift. Very quickly, a car pulled up next to Dana and she had a quick conversation with the man in the driver's seat. The car was a 1973 to 1976 Dodge Dart or Plymouth Valiant. It was a four-door sedan. It was beige, tan or faded yellow and in very bad condition. It had noticeable rust marks on it. It was the kind of car you probably would notice and pay attention to if it drove past you. It was in that bad condition. It seemed to John and Harry that there was a problem with the passenger side door of the car, as the handle didn't work when Dana tried it from the outside. The driver had to lean across and open the door from the inside. It is thought that these brothers were the last people, besides the killer obviously, who would see Dana alive. When newspaper headlines eventually reported Dana as missing, Harry immediately recognised Dana as the girl they'd seen that day. He called his brother to double check and found that John had already contacted the police with what he knew. They've said that their biggest regret is not taking note of the licence plate number that day, but hindsight is everything. How were they supposed to know the importance of what they just witnessed? Dana's family were expecting her home by 5:30 p.m, and when she wasn't home exactly on time, they weren't too worried. She was generally quite a reliable kid. If Dana said she was going to be home, then she would be home. Maybe the bus was just running a few minutes late. But with each passing minute, they became more and more concerned, and eventually they reported her as missing to the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary. Very quickly, word of what had happened to Dana, a potential abduction, spread throughout the city, and her face became front page news. Over the next few days, her family held out hope that her abductor would let her go, or was possibly just holding her for ransom, waiting for the word they needed to pay to get their daughter back. But that word never came. 4 days later, on Friday, December 18th, about 3 p.m, Dale Smith and his family were out on a mission to get a Christmas tree. Not wanting to go and buy one, they decided to go and cut one down for themselves and head to an area off of Maddox Cove Road in a remote area called Maddox Cove, which is about 30 kilometres away or a 25-ish minute drive today from St John's, from where Dana went missing. They were on a dirt road off of Maddox Cove Road when they spotted what they thought was a mannequin. We all know that it's never a mannequin, but this area was somewhere that people often dump their junk, so it wouldn't be out of the question to maybe find a mannequin here. Somebody had actually dumped a bunch of old toys that Dale's young twin children were of course drawn to, and that led him towards this mannequin. He looked at it for a second and realised that it was indeed a real person, but he didn't know if she was sleeping or not, so called his wife over. It was her who made the connection to Dana Bradley, who was all over the news, and they quickly got their children back into the truck. Dale flagged down a man who was nearby cutting wood and asked him to keep an eye on the area whilst they went home and called the police, who very soon arrived at the scene. It was, of course, Dana, and her cause of death was found to be blunt force trauma, her head being fractured by a blunt object. Although information at the time didn't reveal whether or not she had been sexually assaulted, newer sources in the past couple of years do state that she was, with male DNA being left at the scene. Investigators noted that Dana's body was laid out as if she'd been prepped for burial, and her killer had clearly tucked her school books neatly under her arm. Soon the area was swarming with police, but it has been noted in years since that this might have been a mistake. Dana's body hadn't been there for too long, and had officers kept quiet and waited, the killer might have come back to the scene. Although it sounds unlikely, a lot of killers do return to dump sites to check on the bodies or just for the thrill of it. There's no way of knowing now if that would have been the case here. But this investigation isn't really one that we judged for not being good enough. The amount of resources and money that was thrown into Dana's case in the following months, even following years, was unprecedented, and it remains one of the biggest hunts for a killer in Canadian history. In the 6 months after Dana was found, there was a task force of 35 investigators from both the RCMP and the RNC working on this case full time. It was huge. In the first few weeks of the investigation, they examined over 800 cars, but this alone has raised questions. Was every single one of those vehicles examined properly and carefully? They were just trying to examine as many vehicles matching the description provided by the two witnesses as possible, but this was a very popular style of car in the early 80s. There were a lot of these kind of cars to get through in the area. It's more than possible that officers might have missed something in their rush, and in hindsight, RCMP investigators do believe that they must have spoken to the killer in this search for the car, and they let him slip through their fingers. Alongside this, they also spoke to 280 different potential suspects as well. After Dana's body was found, two witnesses also came forward to say that they had seen a car and a man of similar description emerge from the woods off Maddox Cove Road on the night Dana disappeared. Obviously, this is strongly believed to be the same man and car that the Smeaton brothers saw. The coincidence was too much. Together, all four of these witnesses worked with investigators to create a sketch of this man. First a preliminary sketch, and then later a more detailed composite sketch. They were literally hypnotised to provide a better description. Generally, it's believed the sketch is quite accurate due to there being so many witnesses, but of course this was 40 years ago and the suspect would have aged significantly since then. At the time, the suspect was believed to be in his mid-20s with dark, messy hair that was possibly already beginning to bald. He was around 5'7" with light to fair complexion and possible hazel eyes. His features are described as fairly small. As 6 months passed with little to no leads in this case, the task force had to be reduced and the investigation started to slow. There was just nothing, despite the witnesses having a very clear idea of what the man looked like. Nobody came forward with any viable suspects. It's also worth saying here that the Newfoundland police were simply not equipped to deal with a murder case of this size. Newfoundland has a relatively tiny population compared to the rest of Canada, and it had the lowest homicide rate in the country at the time, so this was completely unprecedented. Although there's no denying that they've never given up on this case, there is question over to whether it was conducted properly and thoroughly in the early days of the investigation. Were there mistakes made that cost the investigation? It's a definite possibility, but at least we're not looking at a, oh, she's just a runaway kind of story here. They really did try and find her. In the aftermath, parents of St. John were terrified for their children, knowing that the killer could be lurking around any corner. But years passed and nothing more happened. But then in 1986, something did happen. Somebody confessed to Dana's murder. In the aftermath of this, the parents of St. John were terrified for their children, knowing that the killer could be lurking around any corner. But years passed with nothing. Then in 1986, something huge happened. Somebody confessed to Dana's murder. David Grant Summerton was an ex-con with a history of mental illness and substance abuse, brought to the attention of the police when a note was sent to the chief inspector of this case naming him. After questioning, he confessed, and everyone was convinced that he was the one responsible. Reportedly, Summerton was able to describe the murder weapon, the details of the murder, exactly where the body had been dumped. He included details that only the police apparently should have known. A lot of this fitted together, but there was no actual evidence to link Summerton to the crime. And then people came to realise that although a lot of this information was stuff that only the police should have known, if anyone was paying enough attention to the media, they would have been able to piece things together. In fact, police have made it part of their strategy in the early days of this case to share as much information as possible in the hope somebody would come forward with information. A lot of information was in the media, stuff that probably shouldn't have been, but it was. In the aftermath of Summerton's confession, almost $1 million Canadian was spent digging up landfill and the area around Maddox Cove Road in the hope of finding some evidence to link Summerton to the crime. They were specifically looking for the car, but nothing was ever found, literally nothing. This was Canada in the winter. It was very cold, obviously, so police had to set up these structures so they could use propane heaters to thaw the ground whilst they were searching, but like I said, they found nothing. Ultimately, Summerton couldn't be charged with Dana's murder. He would later recant his confession, saying that the police pressured him into making the statement. He alleged that he was interrogated for 18 hours straight until he was at the point of being suicidal, and eventually he snapped and started giving them fake details, telling them where the car apparently was, where the murder weapon was, giving them what they wanted to know. It's hard to know if he's telling the truth here. I don't know why anybody would make a false confession like this without police pressure, but of course it has happened in the past and it'll probably happen again. Of course, RCMP have vehemently denied this accusation. They say that they would never pressure anyone into making any confession, but the transcripts from these interviews have never been made public, so we don't know the answer for sure. Summerton did actually end up being sentenced to 2 years in prison for public mischief in relation to this false confession, so he went down anyway. And he wasn't the first person to have been sent to prison in connection with this case either. Back in 1982, another man had been sentenced to 9 months in prison for making cruel and harassing phone calls to the Bradley family. It was deemed that he had nothing to do with Dana's disappearance. He was just an awful person who thought harassing the family would be a good use of his time. After this point, the case went fairly quiet for a couple of decades. The RCMP would bring up Dana's case publicly fairly often, hoping to remind the right person of what had happened in the hope they'd get the tip. In 2006, the RCMP reported they were still receiving about 50 tips a year in relation to Dana's case, and the amount of tips would always increase around the anniversary of her death in relation to heightened publicity. So publicity really is the key to getting more people talking. There was no big news in this case though until 2014, when a man known at the time as only Robert came forward with a pretty unbelievable story that might have provided all the answers investigators were looking for in this case. Robert is a pseudonym. I did find his real name through my research for this video, but I don't think I need to share it here, so we'll just keep calling him Robert. Robert went to an RCMP investigator called Jack Lavers, saying that not only did he know what had happened to Dana, but that he'd witnessed her murder. Allegedly, when he was 6 years old, he was in the back seat of the car that picked Dana up from Topsail Road that night. Apparently, she was more willing to get in the car because she saw another child in the back seat. Robert has also said that because he was so small, nobody else would have seen him in the back. The driver was a family friend who had borrowed Robert's father's car, and he watched as he sexually assaulted and killed Dana before transporting her body in the boot of the car. Robert says that he essentially repressed these memories for many, many years. He was sexually abused by the same man and became an alcoholic as an adult, burying his feelings. He said that after he quit drinking, the memories flooded back on me with raw emotion and feelings that are identical to those I felt when I was with Dana that night. Some things I remember very clearly and other things not so much. Obviously, this was huge new information in this case, but the RCMP investigated Robert's claims for 16 months and ended up concluding that a substantial portion of his memories didn't match with the known facts of the case. They've ultimately dismissed his claims. However, Robert has claimed that they didn't investigate for 16 months at all, that about 2 months after initially talking to the RCMP, 2 investigators came to his home and told him they didn't believe him before closing the tip. A few months later, it was reopened, but again, he wasn't really believed. It was concluded that he was mistaken. And this is where things get a bit controversial, as Jeff Levitt, Dana's stepdad, was forced to speak publicly on the case, something Dana's parents have very, very rarely done over the years. Jeff said that Dana's investigation had, at the time, been ongoing for 33 years, that him and his wife have developed a very strong relationship with a number of the lead investigators in that time. They said they have faith that the RCMP has a strong desire to solve Dana's murder, because of the fact that they still refuse to make it a cold case. He says he trusts that the RCMP investigated Robert's claims fully, and he believes them when they say that Robert is mistaken, but unfortunately Robert won't accept this and has subsequently continued to occupy too much of the investigative team's time that could be spent clearing other leads. And I very much see where Jeff is coming from. When I start researching a case, I usually tend to begin by just reading up about the case as much as I can before I start writing anything or even planning the script. When I started the process on this video on Dana's case, I read about Robert's lead being ignored, and I thought this was just another case of investigators not doing a good job, brushing off good leads, but I don't think that's the case. Whether you believe it or not, the RCMP have investigated and concluded that this is not correct, and Dana's parents, who are the most important people in the story, agree with them. However, Robert has not been willing to let his story drop. It is a difficult one because if he really truly believes that his story is true, then I fully understand why he would push it, but he has been asked to stop multiple times by Dana's family and investigators. A Facebook page was started by a friend of Robert's called Terry, called Justice for Dana Bradley, and this page has zero affiliation with the formal investigation. In the true crime space, you do tend to see a page fighting for justice and automatically assume that it must be ran by somebody involved in the case, but that is not what's happening here. The Justice for Dana Bradley page very much pushes Robert's dismissed theory, and this is dangerous because spreading misinformation in cases like this simply isn't helpful. People could have information but decide against sharing it with investigators because of what they read on this Facebook page. It really is one of the first things to pop up when you Google Dana's name. I do understand why people are inclined to believe Robert, and I'm not here to tell you whether or not his story is true, but I'm aiming to share fact here, and his story is not fact, at least as far as investigators are concerned. Jeff has said, "It is lovely to see how many people are still interested in Dana's case, and I would never want to deter anyone from contacting the police with information that might help in solving her murder. However, if it's on the internet it must be true is not the case. One should take everything they read on these sites with a pound of salt. I feel the Facebook site is no longer about Dana, but rather about Terry advocating for Robert." Through the Facebook page, Terry and Robert and its thousands of members fought to have 2 buried cars excavated. Cars which Robert say were buried about 30 years ago in the residential area of a southern shore town in Witless Bay. I couldn't find any information sharing exactly where these cars were, but just in that area. Interestingly, former investigator Jack Lavers has said that he agreed that the cars should be excavated, but not for the same reason as the Facebook page. Although he didn't think it would prove Robert's story, he has said that it was important to have them both forensically and mechanically tested, just in case. Jeff and Dawn also said that they would like to see the cars excavated by an independent forensic team, just to put the matter to rest in the eyes of the public. The Facebook page wasn't going to stop its campaign until it happened, and at the end of the day, it wasn't going to hurt to have these cars excavated and looked at. So in May 2016, the cars were dug up by the people involved with the Facebook group. The post about it on the Facebook page say that they did it despite the lack of coordination from the RCMP. They funded the excavation themselves through the Facebook page and used their own forensic team. Car parts were found in the dig, but the car was in bad condition and was barely a car anymore. Apparently portions of it did remain intact, but the important bits they were looking for that may have held forensic evidence, like the trunk, front seats, doors, had completely deteriorated. But it's important to note that even if it had remained in good condition and they had found something, any potential evidence they did find might not have even been admissible in court due to the chain of continuity after being in the ground for so many years. Without any official investigators involved, how were the court's higher-up people supposed to know if the car parts had been contaminated in the excavation process? I mean, they removed the parts from the ground and then immediately hosed them down. Surely we all know that's a no-no if you're looking for forensic evidence. But luckily, nothing came of this anyway, so it wasn't a concern. That same year, in 2016, it was announced that modern forensic technology had been able to find new DNA evidence in this case. Well, not find DNA evidence, investigators had had that since the original crime, but they resent DNA samples to a lab for additional testing, and this time round they did manage to actually get a DNA profile of a still unknown suspect. As you'd expect, this was a major breakthrough for the investigation, meaning that they were able to use this DNA to eliminate suspects. They were able to go back through the case files to review old evidence and suspects, and more effectively sort through tips from the public. This was/is a long job because there are hundreds of potential suspects in this case. Further testing of the DNA is underway, but up to this point, so 2022, there's been no progress in identifying the suspects. Further information comes from December 2021, so just a few months ago now, which says that GEDmatch is offering to help in this case. We've discussed GEDmatch a lot on my channel, but in case you're unaware, they use genetic genealogy to help solve cold cases, and they've extended an invitation to the RCMP to help in Dana's case. This is huge. I can't find any updates since December 2021, but I really would hope that no news is good news and the people at GEDmatch are working their magic, working back through family trees until they find their match. Now, I don't know exactly what form of DNA was found at the crime scene, so I'm not sure exactly how incriminating it is. Some sources allude to the fact that it might have been semen, Dana having been sexually assaulted, but I can't tell you that as a fact. If it's not that, it does potentially mean that even if they do find the person this DNA belongs to, it might not be the perpetrator, but there's a big chance, a very big chance, that it will be, so we'll remain positive and hope the answers will come out. Dana's parents have said of her killer, "We can only hope that the feeling of shame in what he has done has plagued him with a life filled with worry and fear of being found out. leaving him to constantly look over his shoulder, awaiting the hand of knowledge in his guilt to land on his shoulder. And if the amount of cold cases being solved lately is anything to go by, I would currently be very, very concerned if I were the one responsible for this. I'm pretty certain that he's going to get caught pretty soon, and seeing as the man seen driving the car by witnesses was fairly young, chances are that he will still be alive to see justice. He'll probably be in his 60s or 70s now. But still, if anyone has any information about this case, please do not hesitate to get in contact with the authorities. I'll leave all the relevant contact details down below. And always, if you or your family or friends live around this area, particularly if you or they were alive around the time of this story, please do share. Even the smallest tip in a case like this can provide all the answers. So even if you think it's nothing, it could very much be something very relevant. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.